The CCP has been extremely aggressive regarding Taiwan ever since Pelosi's visit.
In China and Taiwan.
China and Taiwan.
Taiwan in an attack from China.
Beijing now announced that it will hold military exercises.
China responded with military drills. It fired ballistic missiles towards Taiwan and repeatedly rehearsed the assault of Taiwan.
They have launched missiles, sent military ships, and fired fighter jets, all in an attempt to show the USA and the world that the CCP is not afraid to go to war to take Taiwan. But economically, China is struggling. It's going through a massive crash in its real estate market. The population is getting older, and the GDP growth is slowing down for the first time in what seems like forever. As you will see in this video, it's craziness all around. So let's look deeper into if China's fragile economy can afford a war with the USA.
The Chinese economy.
The economy is still being held hostage.
Assessment of the economy, we've seen massive downgrades.
Chinese government considers Taiwan to be a breakaway region, which it intends to one day seize back.
China has fired multiple ballistic missiles.
President Biden is making clear just how far he'd go to defend Taiwan in an attack from China.
Now, China is facing an economic slowdown, and it's scaring the CCP. The big reason behind this is that China hasn't really had a recession in the past 50 years, which is extremely rare economically speaking. That's not to say they weren't close to a recession, but every time the economy showed signs of slowing down, the government would do something to alleviate the pressure. And it's worked every time, until now. This time around, the situation is a bit unique, and the CCP's old ways will not work in terms of helping this slowing economy. Now you may be wondering what it is that the CCP did before to ward off recessions for the last 50 years. Let's go over that right now, and then we can look at why it's not going to work this time.
China's economy has grown faster than that of any other major country.
China's economy grew a record 18.3% in the first quarter of 2021.
China continues to prosper and grow.
China into a global economic powerhouse, second in GDP only to the United States.
Here is China's GDP for the last 50 years. Pretty impressive growth, right? A lot of this growth is directly linked to its relationship with other countries. Let me show you. This is when China opened its doors to other countries. And this is when it joined the World Trade Organization. You can clearly see from the chart that its economy just exploded once it embraced globalization and trade. Its GDP went from $1 trillion in 1999 to more than $17 trillion in 2021. Trade with the world made China the second largest economy in the world. It is strong, but, well, problems are still there. When we look at GDP per capita, China sits 79th in the world, with only $16,000, which is less than countries like Iraq, Thailand, and Argentina. This means that Chinese people are still relatively poor when compared to Western counterparts. In fact, more than 200 million people in China are still living in poverty, earning less than $5 per day. That number is a lot less than what it used to be a few decades ago, but it's still a lot of people. This is why the CCP's main focus has always been pulling people out of poverty by any means necessary. This is the main driver behind the CCP pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into rural China to help citizens climb out of poverty. And this is all great, and I'm not going to deny that. But things are always more complicated when it comes to the CCP. Let me explain. You see, right after the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, which by the way did not happen if you ask the CCP, the communist government made an unofficial deal with the public. The government would provide rapid growth in the economy and consequentially better living standards for Chinese people. In return, the public wouldn't mind the CCP's overreach into the personal rights of its citizens. I know this is probably not a trade-off many of us would make, but it is the trade-off Chinese citizens made. And if we look back more into China's history, it kind of makes sense as to why they would do this. Over the past 2,000 years, China has suffered thousands of famines, and each of them killed millions of people. There was no food safety, no political stability, and no peace. So for people who have seen their friends and family die of hunger, they would take any deal, as long as it gives them some hope of a better life for themselves and their kids. This is exactly what the CCP offered, a better life at any cost. Ever since then, the CCP's goal has been economic growth and pulling people out of poverty. In return, the public has given up inalienable rights like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to criticize the government.
The architect who laid the foundations for its economic miracle, Deng Xiaoping,
guided China from an impoverished rural country to an urbanized world leader in a single generation.
Under him, private companies were allowed into China along with foreign investment. Deng also created special economic zone.
This seemed like a good deal for the public, as in they got what they wanted. The CCP was able to deliver decades of consistent growth, which was literally life-changing for its citizens. The economy grew, and GDP per capita skyrocketed, going from $300 in 1990 to more than $5,500 in 2010. In a matter of 2 decades, average citizens' wealth grew almost 20 times. People who were born in poor village houses were able to afford high-rises in cities in just one lifetime. They went from having nothing to having access to electricity, airplanes, cars, refrigerators, and much more. If you're a Chinese citizen and your living standards are improving at such a rapid rate, you are probably more than willing to make some compromises with government overreach. The only problem here is that if the growth ever stops, people will start wondering if the trade-off is worth it or not. And that's a really scary prospect for an authoritarian government in a nation of more than 1 billion people. This is why every time global economies faced any turmoil, the CCP was quick to start huge spending projects like the high-speed rails, which was started in response to the 2008 global crisis. The purpose of these projects were twofold. First, they provided jobs for people who were affected by the global economic slowdown, and second, they helped continue the economic growth of China, because their country was growing and needed infrastructure to fulfill the needs of its citizens. This all worked spectacularly, because as the world economy was slowing down, China's economy was still growing at a pretty respectable rate. But the CCP took this a bit too far. Let me explain what problem the CCP faced, and then we'll go into what mistake they ended up making. Let's take a hypothetical village, for example. Citizens of this village have no drinking water. So if the government spent money on building a water well, it will hopefully give some citizens jobs, and it will also provide water for others so they can focus on other productive activities instead of just looking for water every day. Well, that would be considered a productive government project, and most likely, the economy will grow. All other things being equal, of course. But what if the government sees this well and thinks to themselves that if they keep building wells, the economy will keep growing? Well, that's not really true, because the second well probably won't be as useful as the first one, and the third well won't be as useful as the second one, and so on and so on. I'm sure you get the point. If the government continues making just wells, slowly these new wells will be completely useless, and money spent on these construction projects will have no return for the economy. Now, a similar situation started unfolding in China after the 2008 crisis, just at a much larger scale. The CCP had exhausted all the growth out of building high-speed trains. I have covered this in detail in a previous video, which you can check out at the end, but here's a quick recap. The first few trains were good and profitable, but then the CCP kept on building trains even though the return on investment slowly started dwindling. Worse yet, a lot of these constructions were funded by debt, and there was a lot of corruption. It's a pretty long story, so I highly recommend you check out the other video after this. This spending project worked in 2008 to stimulate the economy. But because of this enormous debt, the CCP had created a big problem that would cause a big headache in the future. The CCP also realized something, that they won't be able to keep up with the economic growth through big spending projects as return on the infrastructure spending is slowly dwindling. That's part of the reason why, for the last decade, China's economic growth has been slowing down.
In focus is China's biggest banking fraud.
Only banking crisis causing social unease.
Another financial crisis is brewing in China, but the world knows very little about it.
For months, they've been frozen out of their bank accounts with 4 rural lenders.
They'd rush over by the hundreds, grab somebody and beat them and kick them, regardless of whether it was men, women, the elderly or children, even people with disabilities.
This is an unsettling prospect for the CCP. China is still a middle-income country, and by some metrics, it's a developing country. Around 200 million citizens still live in poverty, and average yearly income is only around $11,000. This is why, when economic growth slowed a little in the early 2010s, the government started encouraging citizens to buy houses. This was their solution to keep the growth going. The CCP loosened the lending regulations and banks started lending to everyone, whether it be companies or citizens. This, in part, helped fuel the growth of China's real estate market, which slowly became a bigger and bigger part of China's economy. The only issue was that this real estate market turned into a ticking time bomb for China's economy. I've covered this extensively in past videos on the channel, so I don't want to repeat the same old events too much. You can check those videos out if you want a big, detailed explanation, but here's a quick recap. As the real estate market became unsustainably big, the CCP realized that this can't continue forever, and they tried reeling it back in an attempt to get things under control. The CCP implemented a so-called 3 red line policy to keep the leverage in the industry under control. This made it harder for companies like Evergrande to continue construction on some buildings they had already sold to buyers. Couple this with the CCP's draconian zero-COVID policy, and it makes sense why the real estate market is near a complete collapse. The real estate market represented 30% of China's GDP, and more than 75% of household wealth. A crash in its housing prices means a lot of families who pooled together multi-generational wealth to buy real estate are now suffering. Because of all of these and more, China's economic growth has been rocky. Last quarter, the GDP only grew by 0.1%. And for the first time in 30 years, the CCP is expected to miss the GDP growth target, which was set at 5.5%. This slowdown in China is going to have a ripple effect all across the globe.
The chances of another pandemic coming are low. But that doesn't mean that YouTube is not growing. In fact, YouTube just overtook Netflix in terms of how much time people spent on their TVs. And that's just television. Imagine how much time people are watching YouTube if you combine TV, phones, and computers. If you're waiting on a sign to start a channel, well, this may be the perfect one. And if you are looking to learn how people grow on YouTube in 2024, like this guy who got millions of views in just 2 months after starting, then I have the solution for you. We are opening up the waitlist for our first ever YouTube Basic Academy cohort. Here, we not only share the secrets we have learned about uploading for years on YouTube, we also share how we're able to start channels in completely different niches and scale them to millions of views in just a few months. We will also have live Q&As, a community where everyone can interact and learn from each other, and much more. If you want information on the cohort, then just click on the link in the description or scan the QR code that's on the screen right now. You can also sign up for the waitlist there.
If you go back to the deal with the CCP had with its people, the CCP is expected to provide consistent economic growth at any cost, and in return, citizens overlook the CCP's authoritarian rule. It is much easier to overlook certain things by the government when your salary is increasing every year and real estate investment is always climbing. But in the current situation, this trade-off doesn't seem worth it when economic growth slows down, but the government's authoritarianism only seems to be growing. Just over the last few years, the CCP developed a state-of-the-art tracking system for it to track citizens' every move. Xi Jinping's zero-COVID policy has led to some apocalyptic nightmares like this one.
The country's overall policy of zero-COVID.
Zero-COVID policy.
There are constant lockdowns and mandatory PCR tests around every corner.
Fences to stop people leaving their flats.
Using bicycle locks and padlocks just to keep people in.
Electronic magnetic alarms are going to be placed on the front doors of some people in places where they have tested positive.
And the communist government now also wants to control how Chinese kids spend their free time. Most of you probably already know that China spends the second most amount of money on its military. But what may come as a surprise is the fact that the CCP actually spends even more on internal security than it spends on its military. This has been true for years before the zero-COVID policy, but with its zero-COVID efforts, I can't imagine how much more the CCP is spending to keep its citizens under control. The only problem now is that people are taking issue with this government overreach, especially with some zero-COVID tactics. The CCP has locked people in apartments for weeks, separated elderly from their parents, and even killed off pets, just to achieve an utopia-like zero-COVID goal set by Xi Jinping. The situation has gotten so bad that even people loyal to Xi are now voicing concerns about easing the zero-COVID policy. This is part of the reason why the CCP is screaming so aggressively about Taiwan. It wants to use it as a distraction away from internal problems, which there are plenty of. But screaming about a war and actually going to war are two very different things, and consequences for the latter are extremely dangerous. I'm sure the CCP has been paying close attention to Russia's attack on Ukraine. It was a big surprise for everyone, but especially the CCP, on how quickly and harshly the world reacted in terms of sanctions when Russia launched their invasion. Companies left overnight. Russian banks were kicked off the SWIFT network, and the US froze Russia's foreign reserves. The only saving grace for Russia's economy was that it had oil. China, on the other hand, doesn't. But, okay, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. We'll go over the oil issue in just a minute. But I'm sure some of you are already thinking, China is not Russia. China's economy is many times bigger than Russia's, but it's also very interconnected to the rest of the world, especially to Western countries. Around 1/5 of China's GDP is from its exports, the US being its biggest export partner, accounting for more than $500 billion, or about 17% of all of China's exports. And their dependency doesn't stop there. If you look at China's top 10 export partners, 9 of them are US allies. More than 50% of China's exports are going to countries that are likely to pick the US's side if there was ever a war. Now, some of you might say that I'm wrong to say that China is dependent on the USA and its allies. Because trade is a two-way street. Just as much as China depends on the USA to buy exports, the USA depends on China to provide those imports. Fair point. But, well, this is where things get kind of complicated, so let's try to simplify it a bit. We have to understand why the US and most of the world is buying so much from China, and not other countries like India or Vietnam. More often than not, it's about cost. For the better part of the 21st century, China has been the cheapest place to manufacture stuff. That's it. This is not the case of China being the only country selling these products, and we're beholden to the CCP if we want to get our cheap electronics. We are getting these because they are the cheapest. There are many other countries like India and Vietnam who would gladly take over the world's manufacturing if China were to, for any reason, stop. In fact, here's the list of the top 10 US exports. The biggest ones here are devices like iPhones and tablets. Apple, in fact, has already started diversifying their supply chain out of China into friendlier countries like India. And it's not just Apple. Here's a list of companies that have already started to leave China, and this list will only grow from here. This all doesn't mean China won't use exports as a leverage if it were to face sanctions. It most definitely will, because that's the biggest leverage it has. But manufacturing cheap products is easily replaceable. Sure, companies and citizens might face short-term disruptions, but everyone will soon find a new place to manufacture. China, on the other hand, has a lot more riding on this trade. More than $500 billion in revenue comes from these exports for Chinese companies. But jobs are where the real problems begin. Now, this data was really hard to find, so please hit that like button if you appreciate all the effort we've been putting into these videos. Also, let me put in this disclaimer. Much like any data from China, always take it with a grain of salt, because you know the CCP has a habit of misrepresenting facts. So China has around 120 million jobs in manufacturing, and around 20% of goods manufactured in China come to the United States. So let's assume if this trade is halted, 20% of the jobs will be affected. That's 24 million people quite possibly losing their jobs. And whenever it comes to the economy in real life, no event is standalone. There are always far-reaching effects. We have to remember one man's spending is another man's income. So, if 20+ million people stop spending because they don't have a job, other people's income will go down, and this will all have big catastrophic consequences on the economy. Again, I want to point out that these are not exact numbers, but at least you get the idea of the scale of the problem. Now, this is all just considering sanctions from the United States. It's more than likely that some European countries will join these sanctions, and quite possibly some big Asian countries too, so the effects on China's economy could be catastrophic if that was ever the case. And this will only worsen another problem that China has been having: wealth inequality. That's right. A lot of people complain that wealth inequality is a result of capitalism, and wealth would be equally distributed in communism. Well, I have some bad news for those people. China isn't much better when it comes to the divide between rich and poor, and this is based on data published by the CCP. So things could be worse than they let on. Karl Marx would be rolling in his grave. The COVID shutdown has only made these problems worse, and the recent real estate crash in China is hurting middle-class households the most. So if there is ever an economic slowdown caused by sanctions, middle-class Chinese citizens would pose the most danger to the authoritarian rule of the CCP, and hundreds of billions of dollars spent on internal security might not be enough. So things are not all well at home for the CCP. While screaming war might distract the citizens, starting a war is definitely not the solution. Economically, China cannot afford a war, but that hasn't really stopped authoritarian leaders from starting one before. That's the problem when the entire nation's decision-making rests in one person's hands. Jack Ma faced this reality recently when he made the mistake of calling out Xi Jinping and learned the hard way that the government controls everything in China, even billion-dollar companies. If you want to learn how the CCP destroyed Jack Ma's legacy overnight, I highly recommend you check out this video on my friend's new channel and show him some support. Everywhere you go, including on channels like mine that's critical of the CCP, you hear one thing: China's growth has been impressive. 10% growth for years on end. No matter the size of the economy, that's impressive. But do it in a country of 1 billion+ people? That's nothing short of a miracle. But what if I told you that the CCP has fooled everyone, including me? Their greatest feat isn't their miraculous growth, but rather having everyone believe that they have had miraculous growth.
China's rise has been something of a miracle.
This announcement comes as China's GDP grew by
4.5% in the first quarter of the year.
After 3 years of widespread COVID-19 curbs, China's economy
grew 4.5% year-on-year between January and March,
beating analysts' expectations.
Consumption and retail sales rose in the world's second largest economy.
So let me just first explain how this all started. Just last month, China released its GDP numbers, and surprising to the whole world, it was announced that China's economy grew 4.5% year-on-year, which was much higher than what everyone was expecting. According to a Reuters poll, most experts expected the economy to grow only 4%, while the IMF kept cutting its forecast of China's GDP growth regularly. So it's really surprising that the official numbers are much higher than everyone's expectations. Can China be lying about their numbers? I mean, it's not like the CCP has a history of lying, do they?
Where ethnic Uyghurs, most of them Muslims, have been unlawfully detained and mistreated.
What's surprising is the government isn't reporting many deaths.
Before jumping on, a quick reminder to like the video. My last video, I forgot to ask for your likes, and the video was throttled by the algorithm. And this just proves that your likes make a huge difference in how my videos perform. So please take a second and leave a like below. Let's first look at the history real quick. China's GDP has grown tremendously. There's no doubt about that. You can look at this chart here. But we have to ask ourselves the most important question. Who is counting this GDP? We're not going to fall for the stupid saying numbers don't lie, because in reality, numbers most definitely lie. But sometimes you just have to dig deeper to find that lie. You see, in China, GDP numbers are calculated and published by the local governments and the CCP. There's a big problem here, and to truly understand the issue, first let me explain how GDP calculation works here in the USA. For us, there's an independent federal agency called the Bureau of Economic Analysis, or the BEA, that calculates and publishes all economic data, including the GDP numbers. Now here's the true importance of this setup. We all know politicians love talking about their GDP numbers, whether it be in the US or in China. If things are going good, they love taking credit. And if things are going bad, they love deflecting blame. Basically, GDP numbers are very important to people in government positions. That's why the BEA is an independent agency, so that politicians can't affect the calculations of the GDP numbers. Additionally, politicians' policies do have an effect on the GDP, but the BEA can do little to nothing to actually affect the GDP. Let me explain. I'm sure you guys probably already know this, but here's the simplified GDP formula. GDP equals the sum of consumptions, investments, government spending, and net exports. That means when politicians pass a budget to build a new bridge or a highway, it's part of the GDP. But that GDP is calculated by the BEA, so politicians can't fake the numbers or lie about how much it is. And on the contrary, the BEA has no power to pass any bills to actually increase or decrease the GDP. All they do is calculate what the economy has produced. Good old checks and balances, right? The same checks and balances that are missing in China. Which makes sense considering it's a one-party nation with totally legit elections.
China's once-in-a-decade transition of power was completed earlier today.
Xi Jinping
has just been elected president of China
as China's head of state
and chairman of the PRC's Central Military Commission.
And his nation is on the rise.
And a near unanimous vote, with 99.86% of the vote.
Won by 2,952 votes to 1.
I wonder what happened to that one guy who voted against Xi. Anyway, you get the point. The CCP has all the power in China, and there's no one who is beyond their reach. There is no such thing as an independent agency for anything, let alone for economic data. Additionally, China's economy doesn't work like the US. And no, I'm not talking about the communism stuff. Here in the USA, we measure how much the economy has grown, but in China, they announce goals and how much they want the economy to grow. Which doesn't sound like that bad of an idea until you start digging deeper. Beijing sends out annual goals to local leaders of each province in China. Then these local leaders are responsible for achieving these goals. Theoretically, they're supposed to do this by, attracting businesses, promoting entrepreneurship, improving infrastructure, and several other ways you can see here on the screen. But the problem is sometimes these don't always work. The economy naturally goes through peaks and troughs. But in China, that's not an option. You see, politicians' careers are dependent on hitting or even exceeding the target set by the CCP. Promotions are based on how well your region does. Worse yet, sometimes missing GDP goals can mean penalties like demotions or even dismissal. So, officials are highly motivated to make sure they provide results by any means necessary. Of course, that includes lying. But I will get into how lying has gotten Chinese officials in deep trouble, but first, let's go over the easiest way to hit GDP goals, and that is government spending. If you guys recall our GDP equation from before, GDP is equal to consumption plus investments plus government spending plus net export. Easiest way a government official can increase GDP is just approve more and more government spending. And that's exactly what so many Chinese officials have done. But unlike the USA, the central government doesn't provide funding for local governments to spend in China. The CCP sets the targets, but local governments are on their own when it comes to funding. Worse yet, tax dollars actually just go to Beijing. So that means the local governments have to get creative when it comes to raising money for local projects. I have talked about this extensively in my previous videos, but one big way local governments would raise money was by leasing out land to developers. So if you think about it, governments were directly benefiting from the real estate bubble. The more money a developer can borrow, the more they could bid on lands, thus helping local governments raise more money. Now, we already know that the China property market is slowing down, and to make sure the country doesn't collapse because of debt, the CCP had set 3 red line policies for property developers. But since the CCP's 3 red line policy, the revenue for local governments has dropped drastically, which puts some of them at risk of default. Technically speaking, local governments can't borrow money. So to get around this rule, they would set up companies called Local Government Financing Vehicles, or LGFVs, which allowed them to sell bonds and borrow money. And since these LGFVs were owned by the government, investors assumed they were relatively safe bets. But they aren't as safe as people would assume. So here's how the government loans work in theory. As long as the money is used to create economic output that's more than the interest on the loan is a success. But that's where the problems start. Local governments aren't just borrowing money to improve their local economy. They are borrowing it to artificially prop up the GDP numbers so that they can achieve the goals set by the CCP. I always go back to this simple example to explain the workings of government loans. Let's say you're in a village and your government borrows money to build a railway line to connect the village to a city. Now, money spent on that railway line counts towards the GDP, and it's a great use of government spending because residents of the village can easily, get a job in the city because commute times are now shorter. Now, what if next year the government borrows money again and builds another train line, just like that one, because the spending counts towards the GDP, right? I'm sure all of you can see that this is a very dumb reason to borrow money, even if it increases the GDP in the short term. Now, I will admit, this is a very simplified example, but in reality, a lot of local governments in China are doing exactly this, just at a more complicated scale. They would borrow money just to prop up the GDP numbers in the short term. They're not worried about long-term ramifications of these loans because as long as they hit the CCP's targets, officials will get their promotion, and the future will be somebody else's problem. So remember this. Chinese local governments are over-leveraged, and some are very close to bankruptcy. We will talk about the effects of this later in the video. Now, let's talk about another way local officials increase the GDP numbers, and that's by just straight-up lying. You know how I said in the beginning, officials are the ones reporting the GDP numbers to the central government in Beijing, and then the CCP publishes it to the world. Sometimes local officials just increase the reported growth numbers arbitrarily. Since there's no agency to verify the numbers, and there's no checks and balances in place to deter this from happening. Crazy part is that the CCP even knows this. The CCP Premier, which is one of the highest ranks in the CCP, has told other countries that China's GDP numbers are man-made because of this issue. They know this is going on, but they're not too focused on fixing it because high growth makes the CCP look good. Even if the CCP wanted to fix this, the effects would be catastrophic. Since this has been going on for roughly 2 decades now, the fake numbers have compounded. You see, lying about a few basis points isn't a big issue to fix. But if you lie one year, now you have to lie a little more next year, and then the next one, and so on, and by the end of it all, the reported number is extremely far off from reality. On top of this, no one has any incentive to really fix this. Why would the central government want to fix this? It only makes them look bad in front of the world and their own citizens. And why would local officials want to fix this? It could lead to serious penalties against themselves. And in the past, the CCP has shown that it is not afraid to use capital punishment against government officials. But this really does beg a question. How big is China's economy actually? And how strong is it in reality? Now, that's something that is impossible to figure out from the outside, especially for a small YouTuber like me. Luckily for all of us, there are a bunch of people much smarter than me who have tried tackling this question before. Let's get into that. There's a study done by Professor Luis Martinez, where he looked at many countries' GDP growth and their nighttime light intercity from satellite imagery. Based on this data, Chinese GDP growth over the past 20 years may have been about a third slower than reported each year, leaving its economy significantly smaller than that of the USA. Now, this study mainly focuses on GDP growth, and if you want to read all the details, you can easily find it online. But Dr. Yuri Skasfot from the channel Money and Macro actually used data from the study to roughly calculate the actual GDP of China, and the results were kind of shocking. Again, I want to reemphasize these are rough calculations. It's impossible to get exact data because of the way the CCP operates. But according to his calculations, China's actual GDP is 60% smaller than what the CCP reports to the public. Yeah, you heard me right. 60% smaller. If you want to learn more about his calculation, definitely check out his video. But let's just assume China's real GDP is somewhere around 60% less than reported. That means the debt they have is astronomically higher than anyone has ever realized. Remember earlier we talked about how local governments loved borrowing money using LGVF? Now, I'm sure you guys have heard a lot about government debt because of the issues we have with our own national debt. But one argument most people usually make is that our debt isn't that high, if we consider that our GDP to debt ratio is relatively small when compared to other nations. If we apply the same argument to China, we can see the true scale of the problem. The Chinese government loves taking on debt and continuously lies about their GDP. So their debt to GDP ratio is extremely high. I'm sure that the heads of the CCP are already stressing out over the debt time bomb that is ticking faster and faster. And only time will tell how it will play out for China and the CCP. China has a lot of problems. Banks are crumbling. The real estate bubble is popping. And now, even the economy is taking a hit.
China is now struggling with its finances.
They have this real mismatch between how much money they have coming in and how much money they have going out. They have this increasingly large wall of debt that's maturing.
A $23 trillion debt crisis facing provinces all across China.
But there's one issue that everyone is overlooking. And if the CCP doesn't solve this issue quickly, it could signal the slow end of the CCP's rule in China. That issue is China's tax crisis. You see, for the CCP, or really for any government in the world, taxes are incredibly important if the government wants to continue existing and having power. You guys remember this clip from Breaking Bad?
I'm a drug dealer.
Wrong. Million times worse. You're a tax cheat.
It's a little funny, but kind of true. In the government's eye, a tax cheat is much worse than a drug dealer. Because when you're evading taxes, you're hurting the government's pockets. In China's case, hundreds of millions of people are evading taxes, and that has created a catastrophic tax crisis for the CCP. In fact, it is not far-fetched to say that China's tax problems among nations of its economic size are the worst we've seen in the modern day. China's taxation problem is not even just a singular matter. It is a multi-layered issue, driven by a complex web of factors. These factors include, but are not limited to, structural deficiencies in the tax system, tax evasion, corruption, and weak enforcement of tax laws. Today, we're going to dive into all of these factors and more as we analyze China's horrible tax problem and how it threatens the Asian country's future.
Chinese President Xi Jinping, he has a lot on his plate, of course.
Taxes as a percentage of GDP, it has not gone up.
China's economic landscape faces a series of challenges here.
China unveiled its biggest package of tax breaks.
The government loses an estimated 1/3 of its fiscal revenue every year through tax evasion.
Lower amount of taxpayers indicate lower tax revenue and then higher government expenditure.
What we need to understand as we talk about China's tax problem is the fact that, as developed as it is, China's economy is still a growing one. On top of that, the nation of over 1.4 billion people has what was, until recently, the world's largest population. What this means is that there is a massive demand for social amenities like healthcare, education, and infrastructure, among others. To develop such facilities and fund these programs to cater to such a large population, the Chinese government relies heavily on taxes collected from individuals and businesses operating within its borders. Just like any other nation, the taxes from the citizens cater to public matters and the development of public amenities. That is how it is in China. Or, well, at the very least, that's how it should be. Instead, the flow of tax money in China is quite complex and perhaps unique. This is due to the inclusion of different levels and different types of taxes that are collected. Now, let me explain what all this means. It's honestly quite interesting. You see, the tax system that operates in China is made up of 3 levels. These are the national level, the regional level, and the local level. At the top, we have the national level, which deals with taxes collected by the central government of China. After that, we have the regional and local levels that represent and hold taxes collected by provincial or municipal governments. The national level collects taxes like income tax, value-added tax, and corporate tax. The regional level, on the other hand, collects taxes such as resources tax and urban land use tax. And then lastly, we have the local level that collects taxes such as land value increment tax and city maintenance and construction tax. It's quite a complicated system, and often it involves a lot of overlapping responsibilities, which then makes it all the more confusing. This systematic chaos heavily contributes to the tax problems that they have, as you will see throughout this video. This central government has the authority to impose many of the tax laws that apply to the entire country. Also, by it being a key body, it sets the tax rates for taxes that are collected across the board. This is something it does often, even in service of political agendas, as we will soon discuss later on in the video. On the other hand, the local and regional governments have more limited authority, but they collect taxes from entities within their respective jurisdictions. On the other side of the spectrum, at the lower end, we have the local governments. These collect property taxes, individual income taxes, and other taxes such as car and boat taxes, minor taxes. The local government taxes are lower than the national taxes, but they still contribute substantially to the state's revenue. In fact, they are a key part of the state's revenue, and they rely on those taxes greatly. The problem begins with the fact that they have to remit some of these revenues to the central government, the same government that would have initially dictated the collection rates. This creates tension between the central government and the local governments, so far as tax collection is involved. Often, the local governments in China have been accused of failing to remit their tax collections to the central government, leading to revenue shortfalls and inefficiencies in the tax system. In addition to this, there have also been accusations that the local governments use their tax collections to fund social programs in their districts, thereby undermining the national government's tax policy. This level of strife has created a situation where the central government must balance its need for revenue, its desire to provide social programs, and its willingness to enforce tax laws. This is not something that is as easy as it sounds. It's no wonder this has resulted in massive deficiencies and somewhat of a chaotic system and operating environment. Speaking of chaos, one of the problems that has come as a result of China's taxation system is, well, a debt problem. I'm sure you are no stranger to hearing about China's debt problems, especially after everything that has been happening in the recent years. You remember this, don't you?
China's debt crisis.
Debt crisis.
Debt crisis?
Infrastructure debt is piling up, and China is increasingly juggling to keep up appearances.
Have this increasingly large wall of debt that's maturing, which they'll also need to roll over or somehow refinance.
Just the tip of the iceberg of a $23 trillion debt crisis facing provinces all across China.
On top of all the debt that China has been experiencing, the nation's local governments have a major debt problem as well. One that has increased significantly over the past decade and added fuel to the national debt. China's local government debt problem has been growing since 2008, when the global financial crisis occurred. That global disaster seems to have been the catalyst that made everything worse. At that time, China decided to do something to help itself in the crisis. To this end, China released an economic stimulus plan worth an estimated $586 billion to stimulate its slowing economy and build new railways, communities, subways, and airports. The idea was that in these public construction phases, the entire economy would benefit and employment would be on the rise. However, $586 billion does not just magically appear out of thin air. To finance the stimulus package, local governments in China borrowed money from all kinds of sources, including state-owned banks, non-bank financial institutions, and shadow banks. Basically, if someone or something was giving a loan, they took it. As a result of this borrowing, local governments accumulated a lot of debt, some of which have been used to develop projects that have yielded little to no economic benefit. So ask yourself, if the projects themselves aren't yielding economic benefits to pay off the debt taken to finance them, then where is the money to clear the debt supposed to come from? Well, this is where taxes come into the fold. China's local and regional governments have been relying on taxation as their primary source of revenue. The very same tax revenue that is needed to clear off the mountains of debts they find themselves under. If China had a good amount of taxes to rely on, this wouldn't be a problem at all. However, they don't. Like I said in the beginning, China's tax system leaves a lot to be desired. To start with, the country's tax base has been very limited through various government instructions and laws meant to gain political popularity. At the same time, many taxpayers have been evading taxes for years. So we already have a mixture of very limited taxpayers, and among those, we have a lot of tax evasion. Think about that. It's no wonder that the tax system in China has been regarded as weak, opaque, and ineffective. Do you know what else can make weak moves? The YouTube algorithm. Please like this video and consider subscribing. That helps boost the video's reach in the face of an unfavorable, weak algorithm. I really appreciate it. Okay, back to the basics. This situation, as it is, has made it difficult for the country to collect enough revenue to cover its spending. Local governments, on top of the debt they already owe, are finding it hard to fund their existing infrastructure projects, which have resulted in more borrowing of money. This is something they have mostly done through something called local government financing vehicles. Just so we're on the same page, the local government financing vehicles are legal vehicles used by local governments to borrow money outside of their budget. The government would set up a fake investment company and sell bonds through this company to borrow money. These vehicles have been the primary way that the local governments have funded their projects. But in a way, you can also say that they have been one of the primary reasons why the debt problem in China keeps worsening, due to the ever-expanding ceiling of debts as the local governments keep borrowing. What makes these local government financing vehicle bonds so popular among investors is that they are deemed to carry implicit guarantees that the local government backing them will step in to make repayments should the vehicle default. True to form, the local governments go to great lengths to prevent local government finance vehicle defaults, as they are concerned the non-payment will sully their own creditworthiness and make it more expensive for them to issue their own bonds. So it's quite a vicious cycle that keeps going around in circles and increasing the bottom line debt. This debt issue is no small matter. In fact, it is one of the reasons why China keeps heading towards a dangerous path. The ramifications of it are not just at a national level. They have spread to be at an international scale where things have become increasingly dangerous for the economy of the nation. To this end, China has tried to crack down on local government debt itself. The country's National Audit Office has been auditing local government debt since 2010 to try to get to the bottom of this mess. These audits, much like I've said before, have revealed that local governments in China have borrowed money to finance infrastructure projects that have not been profitable, or have been used for the development of real estate projects. This has prompted President Xi Jinping to intervene in a bid to keep the country afloat and to speak out. President Xi highlighted preventing and diffusing local government debt risks in an article focusing on economic growth and risk. He said, "It's necessary to consolidate the responsibility of provincial-level governments to prevent and resolve hidden debts, increase efforts to dispose of outstanding hidden debts, optimize the maturity structure of debts, reduce the interest burden, steadily promote the unified supervision of local government hidden debt and on-the-books debt, and resolutely curb the increase of hidden debt." Given the way that the CCP operates, you know it's a real dilemma when the president speaks out directly against certain practices. Also, to protect the status of the central government, China's finance ministry has repeatedly made it clear that local governments are responsible for their own debts, and that the central government will not come to the rescue. The central government, and by extension the CCP, will not take the blame on their own name due to the skyrocketing debt of their local governments. That says a lot about their own trust in the direction that local governments are going. To quote China's Ministry of Finance, "If it's your baby, you own it. There will be no bailout from the central government." Harsh, but, possibly necessary. I guess I'll leave you to be the judge of that. Another thing that's harsh is how less than 25% of you guys are subscribed. If you enjoy the video, please hit the subscribe button below. That will help make sure that you guys can watch my future videos. Now that we've spoken about how the tax system in China works and about the debt the local governments have accumulated, let's talk about something we glazed over earlier. Why exactly is China's debt revenue low? Why can't these local governments fully fund themselves and their activities without the need to borrow external amounts? Well, let's dive into that. Primarily, China's taxation problem is characterized by the country's low tax collection rates. China, quite frankly, collects very little revenue compared to its size and the size of its economy. China's tax collection rate tends to be much lower than that of other countries with economies comparable to China's. Let's talk numbers, shall we? According to CEIC data, China's tax revenue as a percentage of the nation's GDP was reported at 4.3% in March of this year. That alone marks a record decrease from the previous number of 12.6% for December of last year, 2022. In fact, when you average tax revenue as a percentage of GDP from March 1995 to March 2023, it comes down to 14.3%. That is a pretty underwhelming figure for an economy the size of China's. This is in contrast to economies like Denmark, which takes 35.5% of their GDP from taxes. Or even the US, which has almost 30% of its GDP from taxes. In comparison to these nations, not only is China not even at the global average, it is basically at half of what its peer countries take. The question becomes, why is this so? Well, in reality, the low tax revenues are partly due to structural deficiencies in China's tax system. The complicated Chinese tax system creates, problems regarding efficiency. For instance, the tax base in China is narrow, and the tax brackets are not well differentiated, which results in low tax revenues. Let me expand on that. In China's tax system, only a small percentage of taxpayers are subject to personal income tax, while businesses are not obligated to pay corporate tax when they report low profits, reducing overall tax revenues. These factors reduce the base of potential taxpayers significantly. It goes without saying that when the tax base is reduced, so too are the potential collectible revenues. What's one thing that is guaranteed to coexist with such a situation? I'll tell you, corruption. Poke holes into an already small bottle of water and the leakage will guarantee that you have nothing left to drink. That pretty much explains the story of China. The nation's tax system is riddled with corruption, and as expected, this has a detrimental effect on tax collection rates. Tax officials are often accused of taking bribes, which influences the outcome of tax investigations and distorts the law's implementation. And because each local government is largely left to their own devices, there is plenty of room for unscrupulous activities to take place. And this makes corruption all the more likely. This level of widespread, unmitigated corruption in Chinese society contributes to low tax collection rates and a gross disregard for the law. I can only imagine that this, unchecked, will keep poking holes into the already small pockets containing China's taxes. Adding to the factors that are currently contributing to China's taxation revenue problem is none other than tax evasion. I'm pretty sure that one or two of you may have experiences with this, so you can understand how this factor is quite a big one. Tax evasion is exactly what it sounds like, evasion of taxes, and it's a practice that violates the spirit of the tax law and is a significant challenge for China's tax officials, which inhibits China's revenue collection rates. The phenomenon is popular in many countries, as we can attribute to the nature of man, but tax evasion in China is quite substantial. It is fueled by the fact that, due to the ambiguities of China's tax system, there's a severe lack of transparency that shrouds the whole system. That then results in multiple loopholes that can be exploited for personal gain by various entities and individuals. Another of the things that makes it possible for there to be a lot of tax evasion is the nature of Chinese tax laws themselves. These laws, too, are riddled with ambiguity and areas of contention that one can cleverly exploit. Although, just like in most countries, it seems like the rich are the ones that stand to benefit the most from this. Talking about Chinese policies, let's talk about just how politics and political agendas can play into this. The CCP political agenda in itself is a big reason why China as a whole collects low taxes. You see, China's low tax policy is part of a broader government strategy to attract international businesses and investment to China. By keeping taxes low, China can offer lower production costs than other countries, thereby making its products more competitive in the global market. The basic gist of it is that the government's low tax policy also helps create favorable business environments that attract foreign investments, keeping the Chinese economy strong and growing. At the same time, the CCP always wants to create a system where they are popular with the masses and they are in favor. To this end, the central government institutes certain laws that will be favored by the people. For example, as we neared 2020, the Chinese government increased the tax-free threshold for monthly personal income from $520 to $745. That was about 3,500 to 5,000 yuan. What this did was to cut out a lot of low earners from paying taxes. Naturally, people were happy about this change politically, but economically speaking, it cost the nation quite a good chunk in taxes. The CCP followed this change with more tax reforms that allotted further tax deductions to be considered. These tax deductions include a wide range of household expenses like school fees, healthcare, and care for the elderly. It also included an element of mortgage interest relief. So think about it. The CCP cut down the number of taxpayers, and then they included several concessions for the existing taxpayers. Quite the chaotic mess, as you can see. To put it all into perspective, the number of people that were now required to pay no tax at all was about 80 million people. That's similar to having the entire state of California, Texas, and Florida being absolved from paying taxes. Imagine what that toll would do to the US. To add to this mental picture that you have, consider that because of these CCP tax rules, an additional 65 million people are now paying 70% less in personal income. That, ladies and non-ladies, is like absolving the entirety of France from paying taxes. This just gives you a picture of the severity of China's tax problems. This reduction in personal income tax leaves the nation reliant on indirect taxes, such as value-added tax, to try and have a healthy tax base. And just so we're all on the same page, indirect taxes are taxes levied on goods and services that are consumed in the economy. What the Chinese government then does is use VAT to tax all stages of production and distribution, from raw materials to the final consumer. As you can probably understand, that type of tax is easier to collect and enforce, because it's collected at each stage of production and the distribution phase. Also, because it's more targeted at businesses rather than individuals, there's a level of consistency and uniformity to it, something that is not quite offered by the personal income taxes. The problem, however, is that despite this policing of indirect taxes, they can't quite fill out the chasm that is left after cutting down on people's personal taxes. So because of this situation, fueled by political motives, China keeps having to reduce taxes, and all that does is just adds to the peril of the matter. So what is clear in this matter is this: China is having a problem, a big problem, and that is fueling the collapse of what until now has been one of the most impressive economic models in history. In fact, it's safe to say that no other nation in modern history has been as progressive as China has been economically. However, the taxation situation reduces revenue that could otherwise be sponsoring programs for the country. In the absence of this revenue, local governments are accumulating debt on a massive scale. Perhaps all these things are rooted in the fact that China's tax system works in a complex, multi-tiered manner, or perhaps the greed of men through corruption and tax evasion is to blame. One thing is certainly clear: certain measures need to be taken while the chance to do so still exists. The question becomes, what measures can be taken? Well, let's explore that, shall we? To stop suffering from this problem and create a better future for the nation, the first action that is needed is for the Chinese government to make adjustments that will widen the tax base. This can begin by making sure that all taxable people are included in the tax regime, without exception. Do you remember when I said about how it's currently like China has excluded California, Texas, and Florida from paying taxes? Yeah, all of them need to get back to paying their fair share. Along with this, as unpopular as it might be for a while, China needs to eliminate tax incentives and improve the tax bracket differentiation amongst its own populace. This step is especially essential because in China, many of the taxpayers are predominantly corporate bodies whose tax obligations are not always proportionate to their profits. And similar to the step, tax evasion needs to be stopped in its tracks. This can be done by strengthening the audit process, implementing stricter penalties for tax evasion, and improving coordination between the central and local tax departments. This last part is especially important. Once there is enhanced communication and cooperation between the central and local tax departments, there are massive benefits that will arise as there will be fewer loopholes that people can exploit as a result of systematic inefficiencies. In all fairness, it's not like China has not been trying to enforce these tax laws.
After implementing a crackdown on tax evasion, China's tax authority has collected more than 11 billion yuan.
The amount of activity you're talking about in China would seem like there's an extraordinary investment in enforcement activity.
A Chinese live streaming personality has been hit with a hefty fine for tax evasion and kicked off social media.
Tax officials are striving to work closer with each other to prevent certain multinational corporations and wealthy individuals from exploiting tax loopholes.
They have implemented various measures to increase their tax collection, including deducting a portion of employees' salaries, reducing tax exemptions, and running advertising campaigns to encourage taxpayers to pay their taxes. These measures have not really been effective in generating enough revenue to cover the country's expenditures, and the country has been increasing its debts to finance its projects. However, a step in the right direction was in 2021. When Chinese livestream shopping influencer Huang Wei, known as Via, was fined a $210 million penalty for tax evasion after having been found guilty of massive tax evasion. She was investigated, and it was found that between 2019 and 2020, Huang had evaded more than 640 million yuan, or about $100 million in taxes, by falsely reporting the commission income she earned from live streaming platforms. To make an example of her, she was fined with a hefty penalty that was meant to deter others from doing the same thing. This brings a quote that I know to my head: "Do the crime, pay the fine." If Chinese authorities keep pressing indiscriminately like this will minimize the number of people who are evading taxes, as everyone will know just how hefty the penalties are. Moving on. Remember when I said that China's tax system is riddled with ambiguities and loopholes? Well, that too is an area that can be fixed. China's government must improve anti-corruption measures by instituting intensive training programs for tax officials and developing IT systems to enhance transparency. This will not only make keeping track of things easier, but it will reduce the blurred lines that so often are used in the avoidance of tax payments. Most times, the practice of corruption stems from weak enforcement, incompetent public service, and a lack of comprehensive political will by those tasked with upholding the laws. With the right political will and technological know-how, it is possible to significantly reduce corruption and improve the government's ability to collect taxes at the local level. I'm not saying that this can happen overnight, but what I am saying is that if it's done right and given time, they can make significant strides for the entire system as a whole.
This is a Chinese vessel blinding a Filipino fisherman using lasers in Philippine territory. Earlier, a big Chinese ship purposely collided with a Philippine Coast Guard vessel. It's not just Philippines. China has regularly and aggressively sent fighter jets into Taiwan territory and fired missiles over Taiwanese island. A Chinese warship cut across the bow of an American-guided missile destroyer transiting the Taiwan Strait. China has also sent ships and jets in Malaysia and Indonesian waters to harass the oil drilling operation in both countries' territories. This continuing and growing bullying by China has forced many nations to turn to the USA. In an effort to stop the Chinese advance, the US military has come up with a new strategy. A strategy to surround China and be ready to fight in case there's ever a major escalation. This strategy is the US plan to not only help smaller nations, but also stop CCP from exerting its influence over international waters. So in today's video, let's talk about the US's new strategy to trap China and how it will cement the world order. Before jumping in, we have a quick rant about the state of today's news organizations. News companies are just focused on being divisive and enraging. That's because that's what gets the engagement, which gets more eyeballs, which means more money. We're not gonna lie, regular viewers of the channel know that sometimes we have taken clickbaits a bit too far just to get you guys to watch the video. That's the problem with news that is served by an algorithm. We put tens, if not 100s of hours into making a video, covering important news, but at the end of the day, if we can't convince you to click, all the effort is wasted. This phenomenon is far worse than the news companies, who have special positions just to get clicks on their news. These experts have figured out that the best way to get clicks is to scare the public, focus on negative stories, and blow every event out of proportion. But that's not what news is supposed to be. That's why we launched Global Recaps. Every weekday, an email is sent directly to your inbox. In it, we cover the world's most important news in a short and concise manner, with links to read more if you're interested in any specific news. We also take the most important news story and break it down in simple terms to explain how it affects you and everyone else. These emails take less than 5 minutes to read, and they make you more informed about the world you live in, about the good, the bad, and the neutral. They are meant to keep you informed, not scare you. If you think these emails can be helpful to you, then you can sign up now by scanning the QR code on screen or clicking the link in the description. Now let's get back to the basics. Before jumping into the US's plan, let's quickly go over why China is willing to fight so many countries over the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a marginal sea in the Pacific Ocean bounded by South China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. This region is believed to have around 28 billion barrels of oil reserves, 266 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and holds 1/3 of the entire world's marine biodiversity, thereby making it a very important area for the ecosystem, even if fish stocks in the area are rapidly depleting. If all these weren't reason enough, the South China Sea is a very important trade route, and as of 2019, around 3.37 trillion USD worth of global trade passes through this region annually. The main route to and from the Pacific and Indian Ocean ports is through the Strait of Malacca and the South China Sea. Generally, oil and minerals move north, and food and manufactured goods move south. As we have covered in our previous videos, China is heavily dependent on oil imports to fuel its economy and its industries. Roughly 50% of Chinese oil imports come from the Middle East, and that oil sails through the South China Sea. And as you guys have already heard the last 1,000 times we've said it, China is the world's manufacturing hub, and its economic growth is fueled by selling those manufactured goods to the rest of the world. A big part of China's exports flow through the South China Sea to the rest of the world, so we're sure you guys can see that the South China Sea is very important to China. But does that mean it belongs to China? We're not quite sure. Let's look at China's supposed claim to this area in just a sec. But first, let's go over the international law that defines who controls what part of the ocean. Just a quick reminder to hit the like button to help out the video against the CCP bots. Coming back to the topic, according to the Law of the Sea, that was signed in UN Convention in 1982, each country's sovereign territorial waters extend to a maximum of 12 nautical miles, 22 kilometers, beyond its coast, but foreign vessels are granted the right of innocent passage through this zone. Beyond its territorial waters, every coastal country may establish an exclusive economic zone, EEZ, extending 200 nautical miles, 370 kilometers from shore. Now, remember this, as this will become really important later in the video. Within the EEZ, the coastal state has the right to exploit and regulate fisheries, construct artificial islands and installations, and use the zones for other economic purposes. Now, every country recognizes this law, including China. This is actually how every country has claimed their part of the South China Sea, 200 nautical miles from their coast, every country but China. There are some overlaps in Vietnamese, Malaysian, Brunei's, and Filipino claims, but no one is talking much about that because, well, all these countries are united together against China's claim. You see, when it comes to this part of the sea, China doesn't want to follow the law of the sea. No. In fact, China wants to follow this made-up 9-dash line to exert its claim. This 9-dash line covers almost 90% of the South China Sea, and the CCP claims that it's all part of China. Now, you may ask, what's the reasoning behind the 9-dash line, since there are no laws or anything that mentions this? Well, according to the CCP's reasoning, a Chinese explorer discovered the South China Sea, so therefore, it belongs to China. We guess by the same reasoning, China belongs to Italy because Marco Polo discovered China. Time for CCP to pack up and hand over the reins to the Italians. Jokes aside, that is the reasoning the CCP has used to claim pretty much the whole South China Sea, and it has led to some very confrontational situations with other countries.
Fresh tensions over a long-standing dispute.
A renewed war of words between China and the Philippines today.
We're now being surrounded by Chinese vessels. They've sailed really close to us, as close as a few meters from us.
As territorial disputes in the South China Sea continue.
Aggressive and offensive, the Chinese Coast Guard appears to block the supply boat's path.
I want you to leave this area immediately. Any consequences in telephone maps will be borne by you.
To assert their claim, several countries in the conflict officially renamed the region that they claimed. In September 2012, the Philippine president signed an administrative order maintaining that all government agencies use the same West Philippine Sea to refer to the parts of the South China Sea within the Philippines. Similarly, in 2017, Indonesia renamed the northern reaches of its exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea as the North Natuna Sea in an attempt to assert its sovereignty. All while this is happening, the CCP starts building its own island in the South China Sea. Not just any islands, military islands. They were home to few military personnel, an airstrip, and a missile system. Based on international law, these islands were within the Philippines border, so the Philippines decided to take China to UN court. In 2016, a ruling from The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines, claiming China had indeed encroached their land, a ruling that the CCP chose to ignore and is not put into effect yet. To make matters worse, the CCP declared the airspace above the disputed land to be a defensive air identification zone, and issued a notice that aircrafts flying through it would need Chinese permission. This move, while they claim will only be enforced in defense, has further strained relations between the countries. On top of this, there was a second part of this ruling that was just as important to the whole conflict. You guys remember earlier how we said that according to the law of the sea, 200 nautical miles from the coast is each country's exclusive economic zone? Well, so there are a group of islands in the middle of the South China Sea, called the Spratly Islands, that all the countries are trying to claim. The main reason being that if you can establish a claim on the island, you can extend your EEZ and control more of the South China Sea. But according to a 2016 ruling, the Spratly Islands were ruled a rock, so it doesn't extend any country's EEZ. This kind of killed the importance of the islands, but that doesn't mean conflict calmed down. China has been using something called the cabbage strategy, or the salami slicing strategy, to choke out supplies to foreign lands. To accomplish this, China will surround a foreign-controlled islands with its ships and destroyers to deny access to rival nations, and then try to subsequently claim the islands. Now, of course, the United States has a lot of allies in this conflict, and we have the strongest navy in the world. One important part that the US Navy plays is maintaining peace at sea, so world trade can continue without interruption. So since China was being so aggressive in the South China Sea, the US Navy has increased its presence there to keep peace. This is where the new US military plan starts. In fact, this was a plan that started soon after the end of World War II. To counter the Soviet Union and Communist China's maritime ambitions, the United States crafted the island chain strategy. As the Soviet Union collapsed and Communist China grew, a similar strategy has been used to contain China. 2 island chains in the Western Pacific are noteworthy. The first comprises the Kuril Islands, the main Japanese archipelago, Okinawa, the northern part of the Philippine archipelagos, the Malay Peninsula, and Taiwan. The second chain consists of the islands of Japan stretching to Guam and the islands of Micronesia. America was able to set up bases or form partnerships with countries to solve its biggest hurdle. The US military had a problem in the Western Pacific, the tyranny of distance and time. Delivering military force across the vast Pacific Ocean has never been easy, even for a country as blessed in resources and ingenuity as the United States. If the Chinese army were to launch a rapid attack, it would be able to move a lot faster than the American Navy could respond if it weren't for the island chain. American forces located outside the conflict area would have to penetrate China's anti-access area denial. A2AD network to restore the status quo that was there beforehand. A daunting proposition. Under these circumstances, Washington might face the unenviable choice of doing nothing or escalating to higher levels of violence. Either way, the national interests of both the United States and its closest allies would suffer dramatically. This is where the first island chain strategy was very helpful in stationing American troops and weapons near the possible battle zone. The main goal of being so close to China is twofold. First, by being ready to defend the area from Chinese aggression, the USA strategic forces are hoping to deter China from launching an assault in the first place. But this strategy only holds true as long as China believes that the US Navy can defeat it. History shows that deterrence is more likely to fail when an aggressor believes it can pull off an attack successfully. If Chinese leadership believes it can achieve gains through aggression quickly and without paying steep costs in blood, money, and reputation, it may be tempted to escalate a crisis to open conflict. This is where island chains are not only set up as a way to support allies, but also as a way to blockade the Chinese inside in case of an assault. As covered earlier, China is a big importer of oil. In fact, China imports almost double the amount of oil that the USA does, and the majority of that oil flows from the Middle East, which is transported through the Indian Ocean. All this oil passes through what some might consider one of the most important geopolitical choke points, here in the Strait of Malacca. It's projected that 80% of China's oil flows through this strait. This strait is the territorial waters of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. This strait is a very big weakness for China. In case of any war or political disagreement, this strait could easily be blocked off by enemies like India or the USA. Without access to this route, it's very hard for China to get energy to fuel its economy, let alone a war. In today's world, oil is the lifeblood of the economy and its government. The CCP can only survive for so many days with a mostly halted economy. That's why, as China's economy grew, the CCP became more aware of its shortcomings and invested heavily in improving its military and navy to avoid getting in the situation where another country controlled the sea routes that China depended on. CCP realized that to become the dominant power in Asia, China must first become the preeminent power in the first island chain. According to the U.S. Department of Defense's Military and Security Developments Involving the People's Republic of China 2019 report, China has been establishing communication, aviation and port facilities, fixed weapon positions, and barracks in the Spratly Islands since 2018. Developing a strong and permanent military presence in the first island chain would give China control of the major shipping routes in Asia and help in establishing itself as a dominant global power. The Chinese Coast Guard, CCG, frequently harasses fishing and survey vessels of other claimant states in the South China Sea. In 2020, a Chinese warship laser-tagged a Philippine Navy ship. A Chinese survey vessel, Haiyang DZ-8, illegally entered Malaysia's maritime exclusive economic zone and tailed a Malaysian state-owned oil company's contracted ship. On the 22nd of May 2020, Beijing announced an $178.2 billion military budget, an increase of 6.6% from 2019. Also in May, the CCG harassed Japanese fishing vessels in the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands. The militarization of contested islands and harassment of foreign vessels from Diaoyu Senkaku down to the Malay Peninsula exposes China's intention and strategy to control the first island chain. On top of overpowering the first island chain, CCP is also trying to build infrastructure and the world to overcome this obstacle. Many experts have pointed out that CCP's flagship belt and road initiative is a way of making sure that China has reduced its dependency on the Pacific Ocean routes. China has built pipelines both in Myanmar and Pakistan, from the coast to inner-city China. It secured long port leases in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Similarly, China has also set up a military base in Djibouti to control Bab el-Mandeb, a vital strait off the coast of Djibouti that links the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Persian Gulf and Asian exports bound for Western markets must first pass through Bab el-Mandeb before reaching the Suez Canal. Between 12.5% and 20% of all global trade passes through this strait. Only 8 miles from China's base is Camp Lemonnier. As China got stronger, it made moves to set itself free of the island chain. This left many Pacific Ocean countries worried that China is preparing for increased aggression and bullying near Taiwan and South China Sea. It's not just the first island chain that China is targeting, it's also building up strength to overcome the second island chain in the middle of the Pacific. Just a reminder, the second chain consists of the islands of Japan stretching to Guam and the islands of Micronesia. China's presence in the second island chain would give Beijing control of the middle of the Pacific, which serves as a strategic military and economic outpost. The U.S.'s withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2017 has emboldened China to fill the vacuum of influence in the Western Pacific. In September 2019, China's economic support for the Solomon Islands led the Pacific state to switch its diplomatic recognition of Taiwan to China. Soon after, Kiribati followed suit. In December 2019, China vowed to provide economic assistance for infrastructure development to Micronesia. Notably, Micronesia could serve as a strategic location for China to counter American military presence in Guam. However, the U.S. has agreements with Micronesia, Palau, and the Marshall Islands, the Compacts of Free Association, which gives the U.S. exclusive access to the land, sea, and air routes of these island states. Although China courts the Pacific Islands with promises of economic investments, they are still traditionally tied to the U.S. This fact adds difficulty for China, as a military presence without a strategic basing to penetrate the second island chain will be hard to achieve. But coming back to the South China Sea, China's actions have left the USA with two choices: either strengthen the first island chain to gain back the advantage in deterrent strategy, or ditch protecting American allies in the Pacific Ocean. So obviously, America has stepped its efforts to reinforce the first island chain to safeguard its allies' interest. Just this year, the U.S. Marine Corps marked the opening of a new base on America's westernmost Pacific island, Guam. This will be the first new Marine base since 1952 and will house 5,000 Marines charged in the short term with deterring and detecting threats in the region. Longer term, the Guam base, almost equidistant from Japan and Taiwan, is also stated to be a hub for Marines on Guam and across the northern Mariana Islands to train for protecting Pacific Islands, including vital sea lanes, in the event of an invasion. If there is a conflict with China, the Marines would be among the first ground forces to respond. Around the same time, the USA reached an agreement with the Philippines that gives the US access to 4 military camps in the country. Even though this doesn't give US military permanent bases there, it does give US troops, rotating in and out of the Philippines, a bird's-eye view of 2 critical spots: the Taiwan Strait and disputed regions of the South China Sea. There are about 500 US troops in the Philippines on any given day, but thousands rotate in and out over the course of a year for military exercises, humanitarian aid, training, and other missions, according to officials. The Philippines allow American forces to stay in barracks within designated Philippine camps. The US already had access to 5 Philippine military bases. On top of this, the US would also increase its deployment of advanced military assets to the Korean Peninsula, including fighter jets and aircraft carriers to boost joint training and planning. Additionally, US and Japan agreed to adjust the American troop presence on the island of Okinawa, in part to enhance anti-ship capabilities that would be needed in the event of a Chinese incursion into Taiwan or other hostile acts in the South or East China Sea. They also added a formal mention of outer space in the long-standing US-Japan Security Treaty, making clear that attacks to, from, and within space could trigger the mutual defense provisions of the treaty. And Japan announced it would begin constructing a pair of runways on the small southern island of Mangashima, where joint exercises, amphibious operations, and missile interception could begin in about 4 years. The island would be a hub for troop deployments and munition supplies in case of a conflict like a Taiwan emergency. The changes in the U.S. deployment on Okinawa will transform the 12th Marine Regiment into a smaller, more rapidly mobile unit. The 12th Marine Littoral Regiment, which will be better equipped to fight an adversary and defend the U.S. and its allies in the region. The U.S. is doing everything in its power to send the signal that if there's any aggression near the South China Sea, it will be far more of a guaranteed win for China. Goal of all this is deterrence by denial. The U.S. has also been busy diplomatically. The U.S. opened an embassy in the Solomon Islands this year in a direct effort to counter China's growing influence there. There had been an embassy in the Solomons for several years, but it was closed in 1993 as part of a global reduction in diplomatic posts. Over time, however, the U.S. became concerned about possible weakening ties with the country. The Solomon Islands switched allegiance from the self-ruled island of Taiwan to Beijing in 2019, and last year, the Solomons signed a security pact with China, raising fears of a military buildup by Beijing in the region. Reopening an embassy there, the U.S. State Department said, was a priority to counter China's growing influence in the region. The embassy in the capital, Honiara, is starting small, with a charge d'affaires, a couple of State Department staff, and a handful of local employees. Just to add insult to injury, India has also started its strategy to encircle China and contain China's growing influence. After seeing all the moves China has been making, a lot of military experts have pointed out that the Belt and Road is not just a geoeconomic plan, it also has a military strategic advantage. The ports have increasingly come to play a potentially more menacing role as dual-use ports that can give the strengthened Chinese Navy a global reach it lacked entirely just a few years ago. These strategic investments are nicknamed the String of Pearls, as the goal is to encircle India and put pressure on New Delhi. India was aware of this already, but the war in Ukraine showed every country in the world how important it is to secure your economic interests. In the modern world, wars can be won and lost before even stepping a foot on the battlefield. India realized that, in the case of a war, China's String of Pearls can be used as a way to choke off India's access to the world, on top of safeguarding Chinese interests. Adding to this, countries that received Chinese money were slow to criticize China whenever it would start skirmishes on the disputed border with India like it did in 2017 and 2020. There's also a rumor that China plans to start setting up military bases in countries that receive Chinese loans. And of course, this was undoubtedly stressful for New Delhi, as it didn't want to be surrounded by the Chinese military. So India started laying out its own plan to safeguard its economic interests, but it didn't just stop there. Later in the video, we will go over how India is taking advantage of China's trade war with the USA to hurt China where it's the strongest, its manufacturing prowess. But first, let's go over how India is countering China's military. To counter the String of Pearls, India started its own alliances to encircle China, nicknamed the Necklace of Diamonds. India is expanding its naval bases and is also improving relations with strategically placed countries to counter China's strategies. In 2018, India partnered with Singapore and Indonesia to get access to their naval bases of Changi and Sabang. This increased India's influence and access to the Strait of Malacca, one of the most important choke points for China and the rest of the world in terms of trade. That same year, India also got military access to the port of Duqm in Oman. The port facilitates India's crude imports from the Persian Gulf. In addition to this, the Indian facility is located right between two important Chinese pearls, Djibouti in Africa and Gwadar in Pakistan. India has also signed an agreement with Seychelles for a naval base in the region, which will increase India's presence near the African continent. While doing this, India has also extended credit lines to Iran and agreed to build a port in the country to extend access to trade routes in Central Asia. Additionally, India has extended credit lines in Central Asia to countries like Mongolia, where Modi has agreed to develop a bilateral air corridor. New Delhi has invested a lot in policies to improve relationships with Japan and Vietnam. These relationships have helped increase Indian trade and consequently India's influence on countries around China.
China has gained control of multiple strategic assets of many countries across the world, one of which is so crucial that it controls 80% of global trade. The control of these assets has even put the economy and sovereignty of many countries in danger.
Belt and Road.
Belt and Road. Belt and Road.
Model after the original Silk Road.
Developing countries will be at the center of that.
Connect Asia, Africa, and Europe.
What's ahead for Belt and Road?
China has gained control over multiple ports across the world. But this turn of events didn't happen overnight. China has been working on this for years. Ports form a critical part of the global supply chain. And when you control the ports, you have control over global trade, which is exactly what China is doing. As of 2023, China has stakes in more than 92 ports across the world. And let me tell you that these do not include the ports in China itself. This is an extremely alarming situation, not only for the countries with the Chinese ports, but for global trade itself. On top of that, in the name of infrastructure development, China is turning many of these ports into its naval bases, a huge threat for every country in the region. But countries have started realizing these threats, and many have even started backing off from these projects. China initially had 101 overseas port projects, but as of 2023, this number has dropped to 92 projects, 9 less port projects than they wanted. Each of these 9 had its own reasons to be canceled or suspended. So, in this video, let's see how China gained control of some of the most critical ports of the world, why it's a huge threat for the countries with these Chinese ports, and how these countries are fighting to stop the Chinese takeover. But before we start with the video, please hit that like button below, because any video on the CCP has a potential to be downvoted by CCP bots, so your likes help out the video a lot. Thank you. As of 2022, global trade hit a record value of $32 trillion. Surprisingly, more than 80% of global trade, which translates to almost $25.6 trillion worth of goods, was carried by sea. This percentage is even higher for many developing countries, and these goods need ports to be offloaded. This is the reason why ports form an integral part of the global supply chain. In fact, ports even act as a lifeline for many countries. For example, Yemen, a country which is facing one of the largest humanitarian crises, imports 90% of its food through its ports. In fact, 90% of the entire African continent's imports and exports are driven by sea. This is not just limited to the African continent. Ukraine is one of the largest exporters of wheat in the world. In the 8 months before the conflict, it shipped around 50 million tons worth of grain through its ports in the Black Sea, a quantity enough to feed around 400 million people. And these are just a few examples of how important ports are for nations and global trade. Now, imagine letting go of the control of the most critical ports of your country to Chinese companies. It seems scary, right? This is what China has done and continues to do with many countries. As of 2023, there are 92 ports with Chinese ownership, 13 of them majority owned by China, and 10 of these projects even have the potential for military use, which means China is planning to dock its naval vessels in these ports. China has been gaining the control of these ports with various methods, the most popular of which still remains the most notorious one. I'm sure you must have guessed it. John Adams, the American statesman, once said, "There are two ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword, the other is by debt." And China is doing the latter. The Belt and Road Initiative, infamously known for lending heavily to countries, especially developing and underdeveloped ones, for their infrastructure projects. When a country fails to repay these loans, the Chinese companies will take control of strategic assets in that country. One of the most notorious cases is what China has done with Sri Lanka. China literally forced Sri Lanka to surrender a strategically located 4,000-acre port in the Indian Ocean region, along with 15,000 acres of surrounding land. China's dream of claiming such a critical spot in the Indian Ocean region would have remained just a dream without the Sri Lankan president and a few other politicians. This is a story of greed, power, and dominance. This is the story of the Hambantota port. The Hambantota port is located in one of the most strategic locations in the world. It sits on the key shipping route between the Malacca Strait and the Suez Canal, which is the shortest and the most crucial trade route linking Asia and Europe. Back then, around 36,000 ships, including 4,500 oil tankers, used the route every year, with Colombo Port, Sri Lanka's largest port, located 200 kilometers from Hambantota Port, catering mainly to container ships. The Sri Lankan government saw a big opportunity here. They decided to build Hambantota Port to provide other services to international shipping, including refueling, repair work, and facilities for changing crews. But Sri Lanka didn't have enough funds to completely fund the project on its own. So, it asked for help. But most of the countries rejected lending to Sri Lanka, since the country's economy was already in turmoil. Most countries saw the Hambantota port as a commercially unviable project. This is where everyone's beloved and dear friend came to help Sri Lanka. You've already guessed it, it's the generous state of China. China has invested in a lot of long-term projects in Sri Lanka, including Hambantota Port. China gave out a $1.3 billion loan to Sri Lanka for this port. As usual, this port witnessed the same pattern every BRI project witnesses. The company that got the contract was a Chinese company. The inducted workers were Chinese. And these workers were paid from the same money China had lent to Sri Lanka for this port. So technically, most of the money was flowing back to China. If we talk about the port, 85% of the funds, around $1.3 billion required for the project, were lent by China. and the remaining 15% were given by the SLPA, or Sri Lanka Ports Authority, making the project an overall $1.5 billion project. The construction was carried out by China Harbor Engineering Company and the Sino Hydro Corporation, both of which are Chinese companies. The construction of the port began in 2008, and its Phase 1, for which China generously charged an interest rate of 6.3% as compared to 1.2% rates offered by the IMF and the World Bank. Why Sri Lanka still accepted the loans is something we'll discuss in detail in later parts of the video, but for now, let's go back to Sri Lanka's story. So, Phase 1 of the project was completed in 2010, with port operations beginning in 2011. Phase 2 of the project began in 2012 and was completed by 2015. The port was fully fledged, ready to tap the huge opportunity it had. But things didn't really go as planned. The Hambantota port was failing. The Hambantota port was unable to generate sufficient revenue due to inadequate governance, lack of commercial and industrial activities, and its inability to attract passing vessels to dock at the port. This was mostly because the ships chose the more advanced Colombo port instead of the Hambantota port, which was just 200 kilometers away from it. When the first phase of the port became operational, it attracted only 34 ships in 2012, as compared to 3,667 ships at the Colombo port. After the construction of the second phase, the situation didn't really improve. On average, the port witnessed visits by only about 400 vessels annually, as compared to average of 4,000 vessels annually by the Port of Colombo. The port started suffering losses. By the end of 2016, total losses had mounted to $304 million, while the debt was ballooning. Sri Lanka had to repay nearly $1.7 billion to China as principal and interest for the loan. The debt repayment for this loan around 2015 was close to about $100 million annually. Well, guess what? Our dear friend China came along once again and, using the pretext of recurring losses, designed a public-private partnership scheme to manage and operate the port. Sri Lanka had no option but to take one of the most difficult decisions it had ever taken. In December of 2016, the Sri Lankan government decided to restructure the port in collaboration with China Merchants Port Holdings Company, or CM Port, to make it commercially viable. Two new entities were created: the Hambantota International Port Group, HIPG, and Hambantota International Port Services Company Limited, HIPS. Now, HIPG would develop and manage the port along with the adjoining land, while HIPS would operate the port services. The Chinese entity, CM Port, invested $1.12 billion for the acquisition of an 85% stake in HIPG and a 52% stake in HIPS, with the remaining stakes given to the Sri Lankan Port Authority. This brought the total Chinese ownership in the Hambantota port to about 70%. So now China had the majority ownership of this project, and it also has the authority to operate the port. But for how many years? Is it 10, 20, or 30 years? Well, none of these. China leased the port for 99 friggin' years. Yeah, you heard that right, 99 years. But the twist doesn't end there. Interestingly, there was no change in Sri Lanka's debt obligations for this project, even after the Chinese acquisition. This is because China didn't waive off the loan in exchange for the port, but instead invested $1.2 billion for the acquisition, with these funds sent to the Sri Lankan treasury, which it may have used for other purposes. While taking over the port, both HIPG and HIPS, the entities with majority Chinese stake, did not inherit any liability. And so the government of Sri Lanka is still liable for the debt and still continues to repay the debt despite handing over the port to China. And that is how China gained control over a strategic port for not 10, not 20, but 99 years. Now, you must be wondering, during all this chaos, wasn't the Sri Lankan leadership aware of these Chinese tactics? Well, it turns out that the Sri Lankan leadership at that time was completely aware of these Chinese tactics. And there was one person who was responsible for all of this chaos. In fact, under his leadership, from 2005 to 2015, the country's debt increased threefold, from $15 billion to $44.8 billion. This is where one of China's ugliest strategies comes into play. That is, to bribe the decision makers and make sure they stay in power as long as possible. In the case of Sri Lanka, China bribed the leadership to such an extent that the president of Sri Lanka was literally called a puppet of China. Every major decision he took was heavily influenced by China. This man, who stayed in power for 10 years and literally destroyed Sri Lanka's economy, was none other than Mahinda Rajapaksa.
Mahinda Rajapaksa looked invincible. His grip on power was absolute. He controlled the parliament. His family controlled 75% of the country's budget.
During Mr. Rajapaksa's tenure, he and his three brothers controlled many government ministries and around 80% of total government spending. So it became easy for China to bribe them and get things done in favor of Chinese interests. The influence of China grew so much that the Chinese entities got their work done without any hassles and at exorbitant prices. This is because during the construction of the Hambantota port, there was a large boulder that partially blocked the entrance, which prevented large ships like oil tankers from entering the port. But during construction, this was not taken into consideration. The port was built, and in 2010, on Rajapaksa's birthday, this port was open for ships despite nothing being done about this boulder. Only a year later, China Harbor blasted the boulder. But what was fishy was the cost of blasting this boulder. China Harbor charged an astonishing $40 million to do this job. This gave rise to many speculations whether the company was overcharging or this price tag included kickbacks to Rajapaksa. In another case, Rajapaksa approved an international airport named Matala Rajapaksa International Airport, which was financed by China's EXIM Bank. This project was bound to fail because just $6,000 were spent on the airport's feasibility study. But more than $80,000 was spent on a lavish ceremony that included dancers and singers to prematurely open Hambantota Port on Rajapaksa's birthday. This shows Mr. Rajapaksa's dedication towards China. And well, China didn't stop here. China also tried to influence the elections in Sri Lanka. According to a government investigation, during the 2015 elections in Sri Lanka, large payments from the Chinese Port Construction Fund flowed directly to campaign aids and activities for Rajapaksa's party. Around $7.6 million were transferred from China Harbor's account to affiliates of Rajapaksa's campaign. And as we saw, China Harbor is the same company that built Hambantota Port. In fact, just 10 days before the elections, around $3.7 million was distributed in checks, which were used for promotional activity, distributing gifts to people, and funding popular figures who were supporting Rajapaksa's party. Guess what? Most of the payments were made from a sub-account controlled by none other than China Harbor. Well, Sri Lanka isn't the only country. China has been doing this in many countries. Some of these attempts failed miserably because China was caught offering bribes. One of them is actually extremely hilarious. In Bangladesh, China Harbor was accused of bribing an official at the Ministry of Roads. They did this by stuffing $100,000 into a tea box. And while that sounds funny, it's just China things, you know? In the end, Bangladesh banned China Harbor from securing any future contracts. The second incident took place in 2009 in the Philippines, where China Harbor's parent company, China Communications Construction Company, was banned for 8 years from bidding on World Bank projects because of corrupt practices. Coming back to the Sri Lanka story, Mahinda Rajapaksa put Sri Lanka's economy in a fragile situation, with anti-Chinese and anti-Rajapaksa sentiments extremely high. The opposition party leader, Maithripala Sirisena, won the election because he promised to kick China out of the country and cancel many Chinese projects. As he promised, he canceled many Chinese projects and tried to bring Sri Lanka on track. But the damage was already too high, which not only impacted Sri Lanka, but also became a concern for China's biggest rival in the region, India.
Experts call the Yuan Wong 5 a spy ship. 222 meters long, about 25 meters wide. It has at least 4 satellites and multiple antennas. The Yuan Wong ships can in fact track ballistic missile trajectories. They can monitor satellite and space vehicle launches, and that's what makes these ships a critical part of China's missile and space program. The US Defense Department says these ships belong to the PLA's Strategic Support Force. A challenge to India, this vessel can be used to spy on multiple strategic assets in India. The Indian Navy is believed to be keeping a close eye on the Chinese ship. India and Sri Lanka are deepening ties, but clearly that's not enough to counter the Chinese influence effectively. Try to look at this from Sri Lanka's point of view. It must keep both India and China in good humor. It needs a bailout from the IMF. Sri Lanka needs that money urgently, and that will not happen until China restructures its loans to Sri Lanka.
On the 16th of August, 2022, a Chinese ship named Yuan Wang 5 entered the Hambantota port. Sri Lanka and China referred to this ship as a scientific research ship. Well, the USA and India became extremely cautious after this move. This ship was operated by the PLA Strategic Support Force, who used it for military purposes, despite being registered as a marine scientific research vessel. Later, it turned out that this ship's actual purpose was to track satellites and missiles with a range of 750 kilometers, which means it had the ability to track activities in multiple Indian states in the south. Later, other Chinese ships and submarines were also welcomed by Sri Lanka in Hambantota. So, China has gained 2 crucial advantages through this port. One, it has gotten access to one of the most critical ports in the Indian Ocean region, very near to the most critical trade route, the route between the Suez Canal and the Malacca Strait. This is because roughly 80% of China's entire oil supply and roughly 90% of overall Chinese trade passes through the Malacca Strait, which China always fears that India might block the Malacca Strait choke point in case of a conflict. If this happens, you can just imagine the situation in China. This is the reason China has taken a lot of steps to safeguard its oil supplies, one of which is the Hambantota port. Number 2, this port has become a key part of China's string of pearls strategy, a network of ports and military infrastructure China is building to encircle its biggest rival in the Indian Ocean region, India. Hambantota is one of the closest points, being located just a few hundred kilometers from India. Though things are changing, with the USA and India taking multiple steps to beat China in the Indian Ocean region. We will discuss all these in a few moments, but before that, let's have a look at how China used the debt trap strategy for another country not too far from Sri Lanka, where it repeated the same thing. The country was on the verge of bankruptcy. No one was ready to fund big amounts of their infrastructure projects, so China lent them a huge amount of money. As usual, they failed to repay and had no choice but to hand over their assets to China, including a strategically located port, for 40 years. This country is none other than Pakistan.
Beijing is developing Gwadar as part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, known as CPEC.
Since gaining independence, Pakistan has been extremely unstable politically. Sometimes the head of state is an elected leader. Sometimes it's a military general who snatched power with a military coup. This instability became a major reason why no companies are willing to invest significantly in Pakistan. In this power struggle, Pakistan's economy went for a toss. It faced bankruptcy several times, and so it approached the IMF for bailout packages. Not for 1, not for 2, but 12 frickin' times. Though it received these funds, they were meant for Pakistan's survival, not to spend on expensive infrastructure projects. Pakistan was not able to spend on its infrastructure development. Well, China was paying attention, and they saw a huge opportunity in this troubled nation. In 2015, it came with a massive regional connectivity project called the CPEC, or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a part of China's BRI. Initially, CPEC had projects worth $46 billion, but as of 2017 has increased to $62 billion, with this number still expected to increase. These numbers looked really good on paper, but as you know, the contracting companies were Chinese. Their workers were Chinese. And once again, most of the money went back to China. In 2002, China Harbor Construction Company built Phase 1 of the Gwadar port at a cost of $248 million, completing it in 2006. The estimated cost of the second phase was $840 million, with most of the funding coming from China. Well, what happened next? You must be thinking that a Chinese company took the port on lease, right? Actually, no. In fact, you'd be surprised to know that in 2007, Pakistan granted the management of this port to PSA, or the Port of Singapore Authority, for a period of 40 years. Not just that. According to the agreement, the PSA also agreed to invest $550 million during the next 5 years for the port development. The Gwadar Port Authority was all set to receive 9% from cargo operations and marine services and 15% from Gwadar Free Zone business. Even many import duties and taxes were waived off. So it was a win-win situation for everyone. The Chinese influence was countered, Pakistan got funds to develop a port, and also a business alongside it. But in 2013, Pakistan made such a decision that sent shockwaves across almost every country.
The award of this contract opens new opportunities for our people, particularly for the people of Balochistan. It gives new impetus to Pakistan-China relations.
In 2013, the management of Gwadar Port was handed over to a Chinese company named China Overseas Ports Holding Company for 43 years. According to geopolitical experts, Pakistan took this move to balance U.S. influence in the country and to seek Beijing's more active support. This is because there were tensions between the U.S. and Pakistan over America's policies in Afghanistan. 2 years later, the Gwadar Port became part of the CPEC, under which China planned to extend the port's capacity and infrastructure connecting the port. China proposed expanding the current capacity of the port, which could currently handle ships weighing up to 20,000 tons, to accommodate vessels weighing up to 70,000 tons, including a floating liquefied natural gas terminal with a capacity of 500 million cubic feet of gas per day, a desalination plant, and a 2,292-acre special economic zone. In total, $1.62 billion was projected to be spent on this new infrastructure. Here too, China would take away most of the benefits. According to the agreement, Chinese port operator COPHC will get a 91% share of the revenue from the operations of the port and terminal, and 85% of the revenue generated by the Free Zone. Though the port is expected to handle 1 million tons of cargo annually and generate a lot of business, Pakistan would hardly receive any benefits out of it. This port is also a savior for China, since it safeguards China's energy needs. Well, how's this, you might ask? Well, it has two major reasons. One, the main reason, is again the same, the Malacca Strait choke point. With this port, China can skip this choke point to a large extent and directly transport crude oil and other energy resources from Pakistan's Gwadar port to Kashgar province in China via roadways. Number two, this port is located just 600 kilometers from the Strait of Hormuz. If you haven't heard about it, it's the same choke point through which 20% of the world's crude oil and liquefied fuels pass. So having a military setup in Gwadar Port acts as a deterrence against rivals of China, the major one of which is India in this region. Even this port acts as a pearl in China's string of pearls strategy. These are the major reasons why this port is so critical for China. In fact, China is so concerned about it that in 2017, it gifted 2 Chinese ships to the Pakistan Navy to safeguard the Gwadar port and adjoining trade routes. Later, 2 more ships were also provided to Pakistan. Similarly, China is going head-on with the US in the South China Sea. Some of the ports that can play a critical role in favor of China could be the Newcastle Port, Melbourne Port, and Darwin Port in Australia, ports in the Philippines, Timor-Leste, the Saigon Port in Vietnam, and its port projects in Malaysia, Singapore, and South Korea. In fact, the most concerning case of all of this is that in 2015, Australia's Darwin port was given on a 99-year lease to a Chinese company, Land Bridge Group. Later, the US showed concerns regarding this move, so Australia reviewed the project and decided not to cancel this lease. Unfortunately, this is the level of influence China has. Chinese use of these ports can be detrimental, not just to the United States, but to these countries too. For instance, we witnessed the recent incident of the Chinese fighter jets encircling a Philippine aircraft during a joint patrol with Australia.
The Armed Forces of the Philippines confirms Chinese fighter jets orbited above the Philippines' Super Tucanos during its joint air patrol with Australia over the West Philippine Sea. The circling lasted for about 15 minutes and the mission was completed without incident last Sunday, November 26. The day before the incident, AFP Chief General Romeo Bronner Jr. said Chinese vessels shadowed Philippine and Australian ships during joint maritime patrols in the West Philippine Sea. The AFP chief says this seems to be China's tactic, pointing out that Chinese vessels had earlier circled US and Japanese aircrafts flying over the area on a separate occasion.
China regularly keeps bullying smaller countries in some way or another. Anyway, coming back to the ports. On the Asian continent, along with all these ports, China either has stakes or handles port operations in 10 more countries that include Papua New Guinea, North Korea, Russia, Bangladesh, Myanmar, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Israel, and Turkey, with Chinese investments ranging anywhere between $30 million to more than $1 billion. Similarly, in the case of the African continent, China has investments in not 1, not 10, but in over 24 ports across more than 10 countries, with a total value of $20.347 billion USD. The most concerning aspect of these ports is that some of them are located very close to the world's most critical choke points, the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. As you know, 30 to 35% of the world's crude oil passes through these choke points. So China clearly is a threat to the world. Now, you may ask, if China is such a huge threat to the sovereignty of its borrowers, if China has and still is relentlessly distributing loans to debt-trapped countries, with so many infamous cases of debt trap out there, why are countries still borrowing from China? In fact, many countries have ditched the IMF and the World Bank and borrowed from Chinese banks. Well, you'll be surprised to know that the interest rates of the World Bank and the IMF are around 1 to 2% with a maturity period of around 25 to 30 years. China, on the other hand, offers an interest rate of 4 to 6% and a maturity period of just 15 to 20 years. According to a report, China has lent around $1.34 trillion between 2000 and 2021 to more than 165 countries, especially low and middle-income countries. China is so cunning that they initially lend for infrastructure projects. And when the borrower countries struggle to repay these loans and need emergency rescue loans, guess who offers these loans to them? It's China, in case you didn't get that. So, ironically, China first offered huge infrastructure loans to poor countries, and then came again with a rescue loan just because they were struggling to repay them. These rescue loans increased to 58% of China's lending to low and middle-income countries in 2021, compared to just 5% in 2013. Now, there are 3 major reasons why so many countries prefer borrowing from China. And if you've already watched our video on how China is destroying countries with its dams, then you kind of already know these reasons. But if you haven't, here are the major reasons. Number 1. First, the IMF and the World Bank does not provide huge loans to countries with weak economic conditions, especially for expensive infrastructure projects. In fact, the IMF discourages poor countries from taking large commercial loans. But in the case of China, it was offering huge ticket-sized loans. So clearly, many countries just chose China. The second reason is the neoliberal and stringent conditionality of the IMF. So if a country asks for an IMF loan, then the country has to agree to the multiple IMF conditions. These include open markets, scrapping government subsidies, deregulating key sectors, privatization, and debt management. Also, the IMF would ask low-income countries to seek debt relief before they took on new loans. And countries must abide by a debt limit framework to benefit from debt relief. So, this was a headache for these poor countries. But again, China has nothing to do with where the country's economy is going and what it should and shouldn't do with their economy. So again, these low-income countries choose Chinese lenders. The third reason why countries prefer China is because China offered them something called the mixed funding model option. In this model, China lends huge amounts to low-income countries for infrastructure if reimbursement can be guaranteed by lucrative commercial projects like oil, mines, or revenues from exports. The infrastructure is then developed as long as the commercial project remains profitable. So basically, instead of just paying back with regular money, these countries promise to share some of the money they make from projects like selling oil, minerals, or profits from other ventures. Experts call this model the resource-backed lending model. This model is primarily used in poor countries that are rich in natural resources. China first applied the mixed funding model in a war-torn African country called Angola. During 2004 to 2010, Angola received around $10 billion from China's Exim Bank, with its oil as collateral. Later, China replicated this model in various countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2007. Where the loans backed by mineral exports continue to finance infrastructure projects in the DRC. Guinea in 2017, too, entered into a bauxite-backed financing agreement with Industrial and Commercial Bank of China and the China Exim Bank for $587 million for its 2 road projects. In fact, projects up to $30 billion have been signed in several African countries under this model. Along with this, China is always willing to accept a repayment in alternative forms like geopolitical favors or acquiring strategic assets of that country. For example, China converted a $230 million loan into grants for the construction of the Gwadar International Airport, which provided China the sole right to construct the airport instead of relying on competitive bidding processes. Compare that to the IMF and other financial institutions who stay out of these shady agreements and prefer to receive payments only in cash. These are the major reasons why borrowing from China looks like a win-win situation at a first glance. And if you're thinking that only Asian and African countries get attracted to these loans, then take a look at this map. If you notice, it includes 12 port projects on the European continent, including 2 ports in Spain, 3 in Ukraine, and 1 in Germany, Latvia, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Italy, and Greece. All these ports handle about 10% of Europe's shipping container capacity. Here, the Chinese stakes in the Zeebrugge port in Belgium and the Mykolaiv port in Ukraine have even reached 100%. Surprisingly, 3 of these countries, namely Ukraine, Latvia, and Greece, are even BRI signatories. In fact, Chinese loans to European countries almost quadrupled to 23% from 2018 to 2021. And it's not just that. Chinese loans have reached the South and North American continents as well, with investments in 10 port projects in countries like Chile, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, the Bahamas, Mexico, and 2 port terminals here in the US. In fact, some of these ports handle some of the highest traffic volumes for those countries. For example, in Brazil, the port of Paranaguá receives the 3rd highest amount of traffic, and shockingly, China has a 90% stake in this port. Similarly, 60% of the Chancay port in Peru is owned by China, which is clearly dangerous for these countries. Among all the ports we mentioned, one of the most infamous cases, apart from the Hambantota port, that not only made headlines worldwide a few years ago, but also demonstrates the influence China has on a continent, is located in Europe. This port is one of the most critical ports in Europe, and the world was shocked when China acquired a controlling stake in the largest port of Greece, the 7th largest port in Europe, the Piraeus port. The story begins in 2015, when Greece was grappling with a massive debt crisis. It also missed a €1.6 billion payment to the IMF, making it the first developed nation to have missed such a payment. This was a time when no one was interested in investing in Greece. And this is when China saw an opportunity. A Chinese company named Costco, C-O-S-C-O, swept in and acquired a controlling stake in the Piraeus port. Well, this was not the first time COSCO was operating the Greek port. COSCO, boy, it's gonna throw me off to be calling it that, first secured the right to operate parts of Piraeus in 2008. Later, during Greece's economic crisis, it acquired 51% of the port in 2016, and again increased it to 67% in October of 2021. So, as of now, COSCO has the majority stake, which means the Chinese shipping company can decide the future of the port. Because of the location, this port serves as China's gateway into Europe and the Middle East. Surprisingly, after COSCO started handling the port in 2008, the container volume rose by almost 7 times in the next 10 years, to 5.65 million TEU, or 20-foot equivalent units, which is basically a standard unit of measure, often used in marine cargo transport. In fact, this port became one of the fastest-growing ports in the world. Additionally, COSCO claims that this port provided direct and indirect employment to over 10,000 people. So, everything seems fine, right? Thousands of people are getting employed and the port is doing very well, and that too with Chinese investment. Actually, we only saw one side of this story. According to Giorgos Gogos, leader of a workers' union at Piraeus, the working conditions have worsened after China's entry into Piraeus. Also, according to Giorgos, the workers at Piraeus receive no safety training, resulting in multiple accidents happening at the port. In October of 2021, the port's unions called a 24-hour strike after one worker died when he was struck by a container crane. On top of that, most of the workers were hired on contract basis, leaving them with no job security. And in addition to all of this, even employees at senior positions were replaced by Chinese employees. According to Marcos, a worker at the port, whenever the workforce tried to raise a voice against all these practices, they were fired by COSCO. So the workers were too scared to speak up. Sometimes these workers even worked the whole shift without taking any breaks. He also mentioned that, at times, his co-workers had to urinate in plastic bottles. Such was the pathetic conditions of the workers at the Piraeus port. On top of that, most of the equipment and materials used in COSCO-led construction at Piraeus port were imported from China. So again, most of the funds just went back to China. From a geopolitical angle, the Chinese presence is a huge threat to the region. Bordering the Mediterranean Sea on the south and the Balkan Peninsula on the north, Piraeus is one of the closest Mediterranean ports on the European continent to the Suez Canal-Gibraltar main shipping routes. It also has railway connection to the hinterland of Central and Eastern Europe, and as you know, the Suez Canal is the same passage through which 12% of goods worth more than $1 trillion pass through this route. And it's not only about trade. About 20 million passengers go through Piraeus each year. Its strategic location makes it an important port in the Mediterranean. So, China has an excellent opportunity to get a foothold in Europe through this port. Considering China's stake, China can use this port as a deterrent pretty much any time. Although the chances seem very low because of global pressure, but still, the chances, it can't be ignored. And I'm not just guessing it out of thin air here. The Chinese Navy has played this card before. In July 2017, the Chinese naval fleet, including a missile destroyer, a missile frigate, and a supply vessel, paid a visit to the Piraeus port. But hold on. These were incidents from the past. It's 2024 now, and things have changed. And are changing drastically. The countries that were once trapped in China's debt have shown massive resistance to China. Countries are opting out of the BRI. Many of them have banned Chinese companies. They are showing strong resistance to Chinese bullying. It seems the world has learned to contain the dragon. And it's not just the big countries. Even the smaller countries are standing firmly against the dragon's might. The same Greece, which once sold a controlling stake to China out of a compulsion, later blocked a Chinese company named China's State Grid from bidding on power distribution projects. Now, this happened in January of 2021, when Greece allowed companies to bid for a 49% stake in the country's mid to low voltage distribution network operator. The Chinese company, China's State Grid, already held a 24% stake in Greece's high voltage independent power transmission operator, but it wanted more. Greece didn't want the Chinese ownership to reach dangerous levels, so it straight away blocked the Chinese entity. And Greece didn't stop here. It also disqualified another Chinese state-owned enterprise, South Power Grid, from participating in the bid. In the case of the port, too, the decision to sell the stake to a Chinese firm has been backfiring. It has been facing a lot of opposition from the locals in the region, with the major reasons being poor work conditions and the involvement of a foreign company. Costco's plans to build a new hotel, mall, and other facilities in the port area have been delayed, and Costco has blamed this delay on Greece's complex administrative requirements and local opposition. On the other hand, according to Greece, the expansion has been delayed because Greece refused to accept the environmental studies provided by Costco, calling them insufficient. And we all know how much China cares about the environment, especially when it comes to a foreign country. On top of that, the people living near the port are trying to stop Costco's plans through legal action. So clearly China is facing huge opposition in the European country. In the same continent, another country made a decision that proved to be a huge setback for Chinese influences in Europe.
The Italians are moving away from Xi Jinping's pet project, the flagship Belt and Road Initiative. Italy has confirmed that it will pull out of China's flagship Belt and Road Initiative, and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's administration notified Beijing that it would cease participating in the BRI.
Yes, you heard it right. The only G7 country which once joined the BRI, Italy, is no longer a part of the BRI. On the 21st of April, 2023, Italian PM Meloni confirmed that Italy intended to exit the BRI. And finally, on December 6th, 2023, just 4 years after joining the BRI, the Italian government formally announced that Italy will not renew the 2019 Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, regarding its formal participation in China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. This wasn't the only blow to China in Europe. Just a year ago, in 2022, Estonia and Latvia quit the China 17+1 group, which was an initiative by the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs to promote business and investment relations between China and Europe. In 2021, it was Lithuania which not only left 17+1, but also urged other European countries to leave. In fact, Lithuania, a country with a population of less than 3 million, did a thing that even some of the most powerful countries on the planet would hesitate to do. It started strengthening its ties with Taiwan, to such an extent that China has even banned Lithuanian products from entering the Chinese market. In fact, Lithuania has even scheduled a visit of its 11 MPs to meet Taiwan's newly elected president this year. Now, if you think it's just Europe who's slaying the dragon, oh, you're wrong. The African continent, once a bastion for Chinese loans, is now slowly and steadily turning its back on China. The Chinese loans to African countries fell from 31% of the total in 2018 to just 12% in 2021. In fact, the Chinese loan commitments to Africa, which peaked to $28 billion in 2016, fell to just $11 billion in 2018, $1.9 billion as of 2020, and dropped to $995 million in 2022. The major reasons behind this are falling demand for Chinese debt, economic slowdown, and China's own economic problems. This is why, as you can see in the graph, the World Bank overtook Chinese lenders in 2017, with its loans shooting up from almost $7 billion in 2010 to more than $30 billion in 2022. When it comes to the ports, the $10 billion Bagamoyo port project in Tanzania, which was signed in 2013 between China and Tanzania, almost got canceled by Tanzania's then president, John Magufuli, in 2019, because he believed the project was meant to exploit Tanzania. Unfortunately, Tanzania's new president, Samia Suluhu Hassan, decided to revive this project. In the case of Asia, where China has invested billions of dollars with hope to reap huge benefits, China is either witnessing cancellation of projects or its own projects are backfiring. For instance, Pakistan's Gwadar port, where China has spent billions in hopes of decreasing their reliance on the Malacca Strait, the project could potentially fail. This is because even if the Pakistani government couldn't oppose the Chinese investment to a large extent, the locals in the region have literally started revolting against the Chinese. In fact, the whole region, known as Baluchistan, is a highly unstable region. And this is not only about China and its projects. The rebel groups in this region are also against the Pakistani army, because Pakistan has never focused on the development of the Baluchistan province, even though they keep extracting natural resources from the region. Considering these issues, China built a school, sent doctors, and promised some $500 million for the construction of a hospital, a college, and various infrastructure projects to supply the city with drinking water. Pakistan even deployed around 12,000 soldiers to protect the Chinese workers. But still, the attacks have not stopped on the Pakistani army or the workers involved on various infrastructure projects linked to CPEC. Another reason why this port could fail is because it passes through Kashmir, another highly unstable region. This region is claimed by India, who called Pakistan's presence an illegal occupation. According to military experts, India could potentially recapture this region very soon, cutting off China's access. If this happens, China's billions of dollars might go in vain. Moving our focus to Myanmar, China planned to build the Chaukpu port project at a cost of $7 billion. But later, Myanmar itself decreased this amount to $1.3 billion. China's investment in the project was reduced because Myanmar was aware of Chinese debt traps, and they didn't want to fall for it. Even so, Myanmar took $1.3 billion because its economy was already weak and it really had no other options. But this incident indicates that countries are becoming aware of these Chinese debt traps. And many other nations are canceling Chinese debt. Samoa, a small country in the South Pacific Ocean, also decided to cancel a $100 million Chinese-backed port development in 2021. Calling it an excessive amount for the small Pacific island that is already in heavy debt to China. China is also present in Israel's Haifa port. Haifa is one of the main seaports in Israel, where about 99% of all goods move in and out of the country by sea. China's Shanghai International Port Group already operates a port at Haifa. So to counter it, Israel has awarded a major contract to an Indian company named Adani Ports in 2022. Adani Ports acquired a major part of the port for $1.13 billion for operations. Sri Lanka is tackling China with the help of other major economies. The US is investing more than $500 million in a port terminal in Colombo, which is being developed by Indian Adani Ports. The financing by the American government's International Development Finance Corporation, or DFC, is being seen as America's move to counter China's influence in South Asia. In fact, this is the biggest investment so far in Asia by the DFC. And on top of that, Adani signed a $700 million build, operate, transfer deal in 2021 with the Sri Lankan Ports Authority to develop and run the strategic Colombo Port's Western Container Terminal. Similarly, India has assisted Sri Lanka with $3.8 billion, which includes currency swaps, grants, credit lines, humanitarian supplies, and infrastructure development. To reciprocate this help, Sri Lanka canceled Chinese projects in the Jaffna Peninsula. They allowed India to invest in the energy sector and built a free-floating dock facility, Maritime Rescue Coordination Center. Surprisingly, one of the subunits of this MRCC will also be installed in the China-operated Hambantota port. A similar story is happening in Bangladesh, where India and Japan have joined hands to counter China. India and Japan have decided to develop a port named Matabari Port in Bangladesh, which would be a deep-sea port that would help not only Bangladesh, but also India and Japan in connectivity. Looking forward, only time will tell what future steps other countries will take to counter China.